The trio of adventurers stood panting heavily, their glowing weapons still in hand as they looked at the torn and lifeless body of SCP-096. Indiana Jones wiped the sweat from his brow, his whip coiled at his side as he surveyed the scene. "Well, that was a close one," he said, his voice gruff with exhaustion. Lara Croft nodded in agreement, her dual pistol still smoking from the intense battle. Nathan Drake leaned against a nearby wall, his glowing axe clutched tightly in his hand. "That thing was no joke," Nathan said, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." "Agreed," Lara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "But we handled it. We always do." Just then, a random person stumbled upon the scene, their eyes wide with shock. Before anyone could react, SCP-096 turned its attention to the newcomer, its white, featureless face contorted in rage. Lara's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. "No, get out of here!" she shouted, but it was too late. The humanoid lunged forward, its long, skinny arms reaching out to tear the person apart. The trio could only watch in horror as the gruesome scene unfolded before them. As the dust settled, Nathan shook his head in disbelief. "That was pure gore, man," he muttered, his voice filled with sorrow. Indiana Jones placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder, his expression grim. "We did what we had to do," he said, his voice firm. "We saved countless lives today." The trio stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their victory heavy on their shoulders. But then, with a shared nod, they turned and began to walk away, their steps slow and deliberate. "We make a good team," Lara said, breaking the silence. The others nodded in agreement, a sense of camaraderie filling the air. And as they disappeared into the shadows, their glowing weapons still in hand, the world knew that they were a force to be reckoned with. The trio of adventurers, united in their quest for justice, would always be ready to face whatever challenges came their way. The trio stood panting heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and blood from their intense battle with SCP-096. Indiana Jones wiped the sweat from his brow, his glowing whip still crackling with energy. Lara Croft adjusted her weapons, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. Nathan Drake leaned against a nearby wall, catching his breath as he looked at the remains of the creature they had just defeated. "That was intense," Nathan said, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "I've never seen anything like that before." "Indeed," Indiana Jones replied, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "But we prevailed, thanks to our skills and teamwork." Lara Croft nodded in agreement, her eyes still sharp and alert. "We make a good team," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "But we can't let our guard down just yet. Who knows what other dangers may be lurking in the shadows." As they began to make their way out of the area, a sudden voice interrupted their thoughts. "What's going on here?" a random person asked, confusion evident in their tone. Lara Croft's eyes widened in alarm as she turned to face the newcomer. "No, get out of here!" she shouted, but it was too late. SCP-096 had already set its sights on the unsuspecting individual, its rage and bloodlust evident in its eyes. The trio sprang into action once more, their weapons glowing brightly as they prepared to face the creature once more. Indiana Jones cracked his whip with precision, delivering painful blows to SCP-96's skin. Nathan Drake used his pistol skillfully, gnashing the skin of the creature with each shot. But SCP-096 was not easily defeated. It thrashed and flailed, grabbing Nathan's legs and throwing him at Indiana Jones. Lara Croft felt a moment of dizziness as she tried to regain her footing, but she quickly shook it off and joined the fray once more. As the battle raged on, Nathan Drake climbed onto SCP-96's back, his glowing axe raised high. With a swift motion, he brought the weapon down, slicing through the creature's already separated head with a sickening thud. The trio stood victorious, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. They had faced a formidable foe and emerged triumphant, their bond stronger than ever. "We make a damn good team," Nathan said, a grin spreading across his face. "Indeed we do," Indiana Jones replied, a twinkle in his eye. "But our adventures are far from over. Who knows what other challenges await us in the shadows." And with that, the trio set off into the unknown, ready to face whatever dangers came their way with courage, skill, and unwavering determination. The trio of adventurers stood panting heavily, their glowing weapons still in hand as they surveyed the aftermath of their battle with SCP-096. The tall, skinny white humanoid lay in pieces on the ground, its once terrifying visage now a gruesome sight of blood and gore. Indiana Jones wiped the sweat from his brow, his whip coiled at his side. "Well, that was a close one," he said, his voice gruff with exhaustion. Lara Croft nodded in agreement, her dual pistol still smoking from the intense firefight. "I've faced some tough enemies in my time, but that thing was something else," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Nathan Drake, the youngest of the trio, grinned triumphantly as he wiped the blood from his glowing axe. "I told you guys we could take it down," he said, his voice filled with confidence. As they began to make their way out of the dark, dank chamber where they had faced SCP-096, a random person appeared out of nowhere, his eyes wide with shock. What's going on here? He asked, his voice trembling. Lara Croft's eyes widened in horror as she realized the danger the stranger was in. No, get out of here. She shouted, but it was too late. SCP-096 turned its attention to the hapless bystander, tearing him apart with a ferocity that sent shivers down the trio's spines. Nathan Drake winced at the sight, his face pale with horror. That's pure gore, man, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Indiana Jones shook his head, his expression grim. We can't dwell on that now. We need to focus, he said, his voice firm. With renewed determination, the trio continued on, their steps slow and heavy with exhaustion. They knew that their victory against SCP-096 had come at a great cost, but they also knew that they had proven themselves once again as the greatest adventurers of their time. And as they made their way out of the chamber, they knew that they would face whatever challenges came their way with the same courage and skill that had brought them victory against the monstrous SCP-096. The trio of adventurers stood panting heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and blood from their intense battle with SCP-096. Indiana Jones wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes still fixed on the now lifeless body of the tall, skinny humanoid. Well, that was a close one, he said, his voice hoarse from the exertion of the fight. Lara Croft nodded in agreement, her hands still gripping her glowing whip tightly. I've never seen anything like that before, she said, her eyes wide with disbelief. Nathan Drake chuckled, his glowing axe still in hand. That was one hell of a fight, he said, a grin spreading across his face. But we came out on top. As they began to catch their breath, a voice suddenly interrupted their moment of victory. They turned to see a random person standing a few feet away, staring at them in shock. What's going on here? The person asked, confusion evident in their voice. Lara Croft's eyes widened in alarm as she quickly stepped forward. No, get out of here. She shouted, her voice filled with urgency. But it was too late. Before they could react, SCP-096 lunged forward, its long, slender arms reaching out to grab the unsuspecting person. With a sickening crunch, the humanoid tore the person apart, leaving a trail of blood and gore in its wake. Nathan Drake winced at the gruesome sight, shaking his head in disbelief. That's pure gore, man, he muttered, his voice filled with disgust. Indiana Jones quickly regained his composure, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to face SCP-096. Let's focus, both of you, he said, his voice firm and determined. The trio of adventurers regrouped, their weapons at the ready as they prepared to face SCP-096 once more. With a renewed sense of determination, they launched themselves back into the fray, using their unique fighting styles and glowing weapons to deliver punishing blows to the creature. As the battle raged on, Nathan Drake saw an opportunity and quickly climbed onto SCP-96's back. The monster thrashed and roared in an attempt to shake him off, but Nathan Drake held on tight, his glowing axe raised high. With a swift and decisive strike, Nathan Drake brought the axe down, slicing through SCP-96's neck with a sickening crunch. The creature's head rolled to the ground, its lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. The trio stood victorious, their chests heaving with exertion as they surveyed the aftermath of their battle. Indiana Jones clapped Nathan Drake on the back, a proud smile on his face. Well done, my friends, he said, his voice filled with admiration. We make quite the team. Lara Croft nodded in agreement, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Indeed we do, she said, her eyes shining with pride. As they began to make their way out of the dark, dank chamber, the trio knew that they had faced a formidable foe and emerged victorious. And as they walked into the light of day, they knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The trio of adventurers stood panting heavily, their glowing weapons still in hand as they looked at the torn and lifeless body of SCP-096. Indiana Jones wiped the sweat from his brow, his whip coiled at his side, while Lara Croft adjusted her gear and Nathan Drake inspected his glowing axe. That was intense, Nathan said, breaking the silence. I've never seen anything like that before. Lara nodded in agreement, her eyes still wide with adrenaline. We were lucky to come out of that alive. Indiana Jones chuckled, a grin spreading across his face. Luck had nothing to do with it, my friends. It was skill, determination, and a little bit of luck. As they began to make their way out of the dark and eerie chamber, they heard a voice behind them. What's going on here? The trio turned to see a random person standing in the shadows, their eyes wide with fear. Lara's voice was sharp as she warned them to leave, but it was too late. SCP-096 lunged forward, tearing the person apart in a gruesome display of violence. Nathan winced at the sight, while Indiana Jones shook his head in disbelief. Pure gore, indeed, he muttered. But there was no time to dwell on the horror they had just witnessed. The trio knew they had to stay focused if they wanted to make it out of this place alive. With renewed determination, they continued to move forward, their glowing weapons at the ready. As they walked, their steps slow and deliberate, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a sense of exhaustion. But they knew they had accomplished something incredible. They had faced a terrifying monster and emerged victorious. And as they made their way out of the chamber, the trio knew that they were a force to be reckoned with. They were adventurers, fighters, and survivors. And they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.